Welcome to the Healthy, Wealthy, and Smart podcast. Each week, we interview the best and brightest in physical therapy, wellness, and entrepreneurship. We give you cutting-edge information you need to live your best life, healthy, wealthy, and smart. The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and should not be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Karen Litzy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Healthy, Wealthy, and Smart podcast. I am your host, Karen Litzy, and on today's episode, we're talking about how to integrate technology with runners. So if you are a runner, or if you are a healthcare practitioner that treats runners, this is a great episode because we have Dr. Chris Napier on the program as my guest. He is a sports physiotherapist with a PhD in running biomechanics and injury prevention. He has an appointment as clinical assistant professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of British Columbia. In addition to working on research projects, Chris continues to be a practicing physiotherapist with Restore Physiotherapy and Athletics Canada. He has competed at the national level as a successful middle distance runner, earning medals at the Canadian Track and Field Championships in 1996 and 1997. He is also an accomplished marathon runner with a personal best time of 2 hours and 33 minutes. In addition to all of that, he is the author of the new book, Science of Running, Analyze Your Technique, Prevent Injury, Revolutionize Your Training. The book comes out on February 4th, so if you're listening to the podcast today on February 3rd, you can go on and pre-order the book, or you can wait till tomorrow and go on and order it. If you head over to podcast.healthywealthysmart.com, which is the website for the podcast here, in the show notes, one click will take you straight to the book so you can buy the book and you can start learning more about the science of running. So in this episode, what do we talk about? Like I said, we're talking about technology. So we're talking about how to bring a wearable to market for running, retraining, and injury risk reduction, what to look for when investing in wearable technology, because there's a lot of stuff out there, some good, some not so good, the importance of translating the research to both the clinician and athlete, and the science of running, Analyze Your Technique, Prevent Injury, Revolutionize Your Training, which, as I said, is Chris's new book. Now, Chris and I recorded this a few weeks ago live on Facebook, so there's not going to be any editing in here because we want to keep that kind of live feel for you all. But if you want to watch the video, you can head over to my Facebook page, Dr. Karen Litzy, PT, DPT, and you can watch the video. Chris kind of holds up some examples of some technology, some insoles you can put into your shoes to track some parameters around your running. So a huge thanks to Chris Napier. And don't forget to buy his book, especially if you're a runner or you work with runners. So thanks again to Chris, and everybody have a great week. So I'm sitting here with Dr. Chris Napier. He is an expert. He is a new author. We'll be talking about his book, The Science of Running, in just a little bit. But Chris, just to kind of allow people to get to know you a little bit more, why don't you kind of give the listeners and the viewers here a little bit more about you?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me on, Karen. I feel like I've really made it big time now on the Karen Litzy podcast. This is huge. So thanks again for having me on. So I'm a sport physiotherapist. I've been practicing for almost 20 years now. And I've worked with a range of sports, but I sort of ended up coming back to the sport I'm most passionate about, the one I love, which is running. About 10 years ago, I started really focusing more on running. And it was basically because I'm a runner myself. I always sort of out in the community running with the various sort of recreational races, training with different clubs and that sort of thing, and talking to people about running all the time. So it really sort of just made sense for me to kind of work a bit more clinically in that field. And at the same time, I was getting interested in pursuing more research. And so I started my PhD in about 2012, 2013. And I focused on running, and I was really interested in being able to quantify aspects of running in terms of running form and biomechanics. So my PhD was on running biomechanics and sort of clinical interventions using gait retraining to prevent injury. And so I finished that in 2018, and I've moved now more out of the lab, so to speak, out of the biomechanics lab, but still interested very much in the mechanics of how we run. And I'm now working with a group of engineers at Simon Fraser University, doing my postdoctoral fellowship there, where they actually develop wearable technology. And so we're doing some really cool stuff there in terms of actually developing potentially products that will be available to clinicians and to runners to measure their gait.
Very cool. And I will also add that you were sort of at the helm of the 3rd Annual World Conference of Sport Physiotherapy in Vancouver this year. It was an amazing event. You and the team, you guys did such an amazing job. And I'm sure that's the feedback that you have probably got from the conference from the people who attended. So I just wanted to give you guys some more accolades and a nice shout out, because it was a really, really well run conference with some great info. So congratulations.
I appreciate that. And yeah, that is the feedback we've had, which was fantastic to hear from across the board. And I'm really looking forward to our continued Sport Physiotherapy Canada conferences, which will be a biannual event, and as well the next World Congress, which will be excellent, I'm sure, as it's being hosted in Denmark.
Yeah, that'll be fun. And that's in 2021. So that'll be a good time.
Yeah.
And again, if you're watching live, I know I saw a couple of viewers watching live. At the end of this, hopefully, we're going to give away Chris's book. It doesn't come out till February 4th, but if you write your name or a comment or where you're watching from in the comment section, you're automatically in the running for a free copy of The Science of Running by Chris Napier, which is very exciting. So Chris, let's talk about wearables. So when I think of wearables, to me, it makes me think of like a Fitbit or maybe an Apple Watch or something like that. So in your introduction, you'd said that you're working with a lab at through your postdoc. So when you say wearables, is that what you mean, or are you talking about something else?
Yeah, so I mean, a wearable is really a broad category, and for anyone who follows the Consumer Electronics Show, which was just recently in Las Vegas, that I think that area is huge right now across the board, and we think of it very much in the health lens, but really a wearable is anything you can wear on your body that tracks something, whether it's your heart rate or your breathing rate or your pulse or your blood pressure or skin temperature or joint angles, impact forces. I mean, it goes on and on. Really, anything we can measure through something we can wear. So, by nature, it's something that's portable. Often they'll connect with some sort of app, either on a Bluetooth device, or will sort of record onto the actual hardware itself for download later. That's the other side of it is, beyond the wearable, the actual interpretation of the data and the visualization of that and that sort of thing. That's a whole other field as well. But the lab I'm in is looking at wearables that can measure health-related metrics. And so some of the projects we have going on there are looking at recovery from stroke, or looking at fine motor function, that sort of thing. And my area specifically is looking at application to running.
And so when, I think about application to running, and you think about, perhaps using a wearable to enhance someone's running, whether it be their running gait, their endurance, their times. And what I think of right off the bat is a running analysis where you've got someone on a treadmill and you've got multiple cameras and they've got dots all over them and all their joints, which is not something that every clinic has the ability to do because those setups can be quite expensive. So what are you doing within your research that might be a little different and offer clinicians something that might be more practical?
Yeah, so what you described there, that sort of motion capture, 3D motion capture analysis, which is sometimes done on an instrumented treadmill, which will give you force information as well as the joint position movements. But that was my PhD. So that's what I did. I looked at basically a snapshot of people running, and then assumed that that's how they ran when they left the lab. Which is a big assumption, right?
Yeah.
And so what we're doing is we're trying to get those same measurements, but in something that can be worn outside of the lab and in the natural environment, which gives us, it opens a whole other world to what we can measure. We can measure things where, rather than on a treadmill, which might be unnatural for a lot of people, we can measure them running on the road or through trails or uphill or downhill. We can measure how their mechanics change throughout the course of a run, so we can see what happens when they start to get fatigued. We can measure it in a race situation, when people perhaps run differently because they're pushing themselves to their limits. We can also measure over time, over weeks or training blocks, so we can see what happens to people's mechanics as a more chronic sort of fatigue sets in. So there's a lot of stuff there that we can study. And in our lab, we have sort of the ability to embed some of these wearables into garments. And so essentially we're developing smart garments. And we published a recent paper looking at using a set of running tights to measure hip, knee, and ankle kinematics during running. And we developed this, and I think compared to the gold standard, which is still the 3D motion capture in the lab, these tights do very well at measuring that movement. Which is exciting because then we can start to produce these and runners can start collecting data wherever they run.
Yeah, which obviously seems a little bit more practical than, like you said, just being on a treadmill. We know running on a treadmill is definitely different than running on the road or the track or real life situations. And is that something that let's say your average physical therapist practicing PT like myself, if someone comes to me with a running related injury, and I don't have access to a 3D running analysis, is this something that I would be able to say to this potential patient, hey, listen, I have some wearable technology that you can use that might give us a better picture as to what's happening when you're running?
Yeah, we're not there yet, but that's certainly where we're going. Okay. So, I guess potentially we could put this pair of tights on a runner, and we could track their hip, knee, and ankle kinematics while they run either on the treadmill in the clinic, or we could send them outside and have them go for a run and come back. Or these could be something that the clinic can loan out or rent out, and maybe patients keep them for a week, so you can track their running mechanics over the course of a week, and then that could potentially be uploaded to a cloud or brought back to the clinic and downloaded, so that you could look at their data over time. And what we're using are strain sensors to be able to measure kinematics.
And what does that mean? What's a strain sensor?
Well, essentially, these are thread-like sensors that the amount of strain produced can give us an idea of how much movement is occurring.
Okay, and that's sort of sewn into the fabric of the garment. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And we've done, a lot of the research we do is looking at where we need to place these and how many sensors we need and that sort of thing. And so that was the big work sort of involved in developing these tights, is to figure out how many, can we get away with just having 3 or 4 sensors, which reduces the cost of energy and also the amount of processing involved, and where can we put those to optimize the metrics we're looking at. But you can also then add inertial measurement units, or IMUs, which have accelerometers and gyroscopes in them, which can then add a whole other layer. So we can look at impact, we can look at angular velocity and things like that. So we're looking at integrating those things right now as well.
And all of that can be sewn into the fabric of a pair of tights?
Yeah, we're talking about pretty small,
tiny,
small things here. Yeah,
that's wild. And so, you did a study, kind of taking these tights and looking at, well, how many sensors do we need, and where do they need to be placed? And was this sort of a preliminary study? Because I can understand the need for knowing how many sensors you need and where to place them, and then kind of recruiting a larger amount of runners to kind of study to see, does this do what it says it's going to do? And in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So right now, just so that the viewers and so that I myself get a better idea. So right now you're sort of in that developmental stage where you're looking at where to place them and how many, and do they work?
Yeah, we've done that. So basically this study was that. So we're happy with where they are and the number for what we want to measure. And so now what we're doing is, can we use these to give us information about the fatigue state that runners are in. So when we're getting into machine learning and that sort of thing as well with this. So can we classify a runner as being fatigued or not, for instance, based on the information we're getting from these tights, or and then, as I said before, like, can we get these out now and actually get people using them so we can start collecting large data sets?
Right.
Because, that's where it gets interesting. Can we get these out to hundreds and thousands of people to be able to start collecting data on those numbers, and really start to refine the technology and perhaps see some interesting patterns? There's some of the studies coming out of Reid Ferber's lab in Calgary have been doing that. They use the now defunct Lumo device, which was an IMU situated on the waist. And they've done some really interesting work with like Kristen Claremont leading that, and Lauren Benson, looking at sort of classifying situations or types of runners based on the data they've gotten from those devices. Mm-hmm. So we'd be looking at maybe doing some similar work with our device.
Yeah, I mean, very cool. And I guess the next question is why should we care? So as physical therapists or even as runners, like, yes, this technology is cool. It has the potential to give us a lot of data and a lot of information, but why do we care about that?
Yeah, exactly. So, I think first of all, we have to figure out, is this going to give us information that is, I think we can be happy that it would be reliable, but really we're looking at the validity of it, right? Are we getting information where we're going to see patterns that lead to injury? And that's kind of where we're going with this. But at this point, we can't say that. That's where we need those large numbers. Mm-hmm. And hopefully, I think that's what we will find, is that we can kind of see trends. I mean, there may be a time where, these are sold in running stores and people just wear them, and then, they get injured and they come in and say, hey, yeah, here's my data. Check it out and, see if you can figure out why I got injured. Maybe we'll get to that point. But I think for now, it offers the clinician a chance to be able to analyze someone's running gait. So you get that kind of objective information. And then maybe they can use that over sort of repeated visits, if they're looking at trying to retrain someone's gait, or if they're looking for some changes due to the intervention that they're applying, whether it's strengthening or gait retraining or something else. So I think that it gives us another tool really to measure something dynamically that, until now we could only really do in a specialized biomechanics lab, which, as you said, is very expensive and time consuming, and really maybe only giving us a snapshot in the end.
Right. Versus being able to see the bigger picture of a runner.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah, very cool.
And also, maybe some of the work I'm doing is looking at monitoring training load. And, if you're kind of familiar with the training load research, there's this sort of concept of internal and external load. And, the external load might be the number of kilometers or miles that you run in a week, or the number of minutes that you run in a week. And the internal load would be some sort of intensity measure or rating perceived exertion. And so, my interest is, can we get a bit more specific perhaps about that external load? So we're not just looking at minutes or miles, but we're looking at, cumulative impact. And I've actually got a paper in review right now where we looked at that using the RunScribe sensors, which are little pods that you put on your laces on your shoes. And they can measure shock, which is sort of a resultant impact force, resultant acceleration when you hit the ground. And we looked at whether there's a difference between looking at just cumulative minutes in a run versus number of steps versus cumulative shock. And we found differences, and with the cumulative shock, we're going into now a deeper analysis on that, where we're looking for, are there changes depending on the type of run that the person did? So is it a more specific measure when someone is changing the terrain that they're running on, or changing their intensity on a regular basis? If someone goes and runs the same route every day at the same pace, then we're probably not going to get more information by measuring that cumulative shock. But if they're running in trails one day and roads the next day, and then they're doing interval workout, or then they're doing a long run, we might get more information out of cumulative shock or some similar measure, as opposed to just the minutes or miles that they run.
Right. Yeah. So just adding another element to, again, the overall picture of that runner. So like, for example, like you said, you could have someone who says, oh, I run 10 miles. I'm just making this up, 10 miles every week. And I haven't changed how many miles I run, but yet they're coming to see you for patellofemoral pain, or maybe they're coming to see you with anterior shin pain. But what you're not getting is, well, I run the same amount, but this time I did it on a trail, and this time I did it on concrete, and this was on a rubberized track or something like that. So I would assume that with that shock, you would be able to kind of see the difference. And then as a therapist, say, hey, listen, I don't want you to stop running, but maybe let's stop doing XYZ.
Exactly. It allows us not only to look at what has happened, but also to prescribe in the future, right? So potentially we can then say, okay, we need to keep that cumulative shock below a certain level, or increase it gradually. And so if that's something that they can monitor on their own outside the clinic, great. And I've done that a little bit with some people, just more experimentally at the moment. But I've had people who are really interested in sort of tracking that. They've done that, and it's actually been quite successful so far.
Yeah, no, it sounds very reasonable to me as the therapist, and certainly as I would think for the runner, because oftentimes when runners get injured, and first off they're told to not run, that doesn't go over very well.
No,
with runners, because runners want to run. And it's also not just the running, but it's part of stress relief. It's part of what makes them happy. And so to be able to say, hey, listen, we're collecting all this data on you, and this is what we found, this is what you can do, I feel like it gives control back to the patient or to the runner, so that they're not spinning, right?
Yeah. There was a great paper just published last month that essentially looked at what do runners do when they can't run, right? So if they're injured and they can't run, what do? And the answer was nothing.
Oh, no.
They don't do other activities. They just because they just want to run. And that sort of, I think, validated most runners' feelings. We talk about cross training and, go get on the bike or go pool run or swim. But I mean, the greatest thing about running is you can put on some running shoes and head out the door, and you can fit it in anywhere, anytime, sort of thing. So it becomes much harder to fit in that exercise when you have to go to a pool or go to a gym to get it done, right?
Yeah. Oh, no question. No question. And then I would think it must be even harder for some, not all, but some runners to get back to running after an injury. There's fear involved there. They don't want to get injured again. They may sort of taper back to the point where maybe now they're not even happy with their running.
Yep. Yeah, and so often, we prescribe like a walk-run program to get someone back in because it's sort of graduated impacts, right? So again, looking at that cumulative shock is what we're trying to do there is gradually ease someone back in to doing that. Even if they've kept the fitness, even if they have been on the bike or something like that, when you get back after a prolonged period off of running, it can hurt, right? Because of the impacts that you don't get in other activities. And so again, that's where if we can measure that and monitor it, I think that's a big advantage.
Absolutely. Now, before we get to the book, which I want to get to in a second, are there any other cool tech things when it comes to runners that maybe you have worked with or that you've seen, maybe not, that it's in the lab that you're in, but that might be coming down the pipeline that we can, as runners or as healthcare providers, we can kind of get excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think...
and the answer might be a lot, but you can just pick...
Yeah, I would say a lot of the kind of more research grade, or maybe not a lot, but some of the more research grade companies are starting to shift, I think, a bit more to clinician or consumer level products. And one reason for that is the hardware is just getting cheaper, so it's possible. And then also, I think, the ability to fit these into or integrate these into apps where you have the visualization side and you can actually get easy interpretation of the data. I think that's also, we're going to start to see more and more of these devices available in clinical settings and consumer settings. And I think one that comes to mind is iMeasure-U is basically an IMU, inertial measurement unit, that now owned by Vicon, but they're starting to I think offer products that are a bit more clinician friendly, where you can get real-time feedback. You can strap these on someone's tibia and have them run in the clinic and get some real-time feedback and visualize it and give feedback if they're reaching certain thresholds. So if you're trying to get them to run softly, for instance, you can get them to run, and this will give you feedback when they're going over a certain threshold. Another Vancouver-based company that I'm doing some research with is called Plantika. This is actually their product here. It's just an insole. So you can just pop this into your shoe, replace the insole in your shoe. And in the bottom of it, I don't know if you can see here, but there's this is an IMU here. So it's very thin. Obviously, it fits right into the insole, and you don't really feel it when you're in there. But it's a very strong piece of hardware, and you can pop that in your shoe. And the nice thing about that is it's actually measuring that, it's measuring accelerations. It's got an accelerometer, but it's measuring that impact at that point where it's hitting your body. So it's right underneath your heel. And so we're doing some interesting work where we're looking at different footwear and how that changes the impact at that point, because to date a lot of the research is using ground reaction forces, which are measured underneath the shoe, right? That's the shoe ground interaction, or they're using tibial accelerometers, which are measuring that force once it's gone through the foot and the ankle complex and is reaching the tibia. So,
right, so some of those forces have already been
dissipated, right?
Right, through the ankle or through the shoe.
Exactly.
Cushion of the shoe, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a cool tool, and I think they're really keen to start using this. They're targeting clinicians because I think this is an easy one that and I'm using it in the clinic right now, where people come in and when we do the gait analysis, I just slip these into their shoes, and it just gives us that much more information. Cool. It visualizes asymmetries really nicely as well, and they're also looking at beyond running. They're looking at use in ACL rehab and that sort of thing. As well.
And are there any things you can think of that, let's say, your average physical therapist needs to watch out for, right? So you have a lot of, because I know you had mentioned more research-based consumer products. I'm assuming that there are products out there that might not be the best.
Yeah, so
what are things that we as consumers, without naming names, obviously, but things that we can look at when we're looking at a company that's selling one of these like wearables and what their claims are?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, the hardware has to be good. And when I say that, I mean, you need to have a high enough sampling rate to be able to measure what you want to measure. If you have an accelerometer that's sampling at 60 hertz, for instance, if you're trying to capture that, and you're going to miss peaks of data and steps, and so it's just not going to be something that's reliable. Okay. And if you're measuring it at up at the waist, perhaps, then it's okay because we don't need as high frequencies at the waist. So for that, you need to have a product that can sample at a high enough rate, and there's papers out there that have looked at that, for kinetic and kinematic information, the sort of minimum requirement you would need.
And what would that be? Do you know off the top of your head?
Well, so typically for kinetic information, it's about you need like 500 hertz. For kinematic, it would be more like 200 hertz. Uh-huh. For the kinetics, it's going to depend on the placement for sure. But typically you want to aim for something that's about 500 hertz, okay. Which a lot of consumer level products wouldn't have that high. Mm-hmm. And then also something like the dynamic range would be important, and that's just essentially how many Gs they can measure. And so if you're using something that only measures up to 10 G, then when you put that on your shoe and you're trying to, and there's impacts that are up around 20 G, then you're really not going to be capturing that, obviously, right? So it's missing that information again. So that's something to be wary of. I think the other side of it, outside of the hardware, would be looking at the output you get. And so some of these outputs you get are very general. Typically you'll have like, I put on my Garmin watch and go for a run, and at the end of it, it tells me I need to rest for 36 hours before my next effort or something like that. And I never really sort of regard that. It doesn't really it doesn't make sense. I can interpret that much better myself than relying on my watch. It also spits out a bunch of other metrics. Some of them might be useful, others I would just sort of disregard. And I think that's where probably clinical decision making comes into it, and having a knowledge of the activity and the person in front of you. Don't be overly reliant on just sort of what the metric is outputting to you. So
if you have, let's say, a certain wearable on, and it gives you, I'm again making something up, like 10 different kinds of outputs. I don't even know if that's possible, but you want to kind of is it sort of like you're taking what you need as it relates to what the patient's going through? Well, or are you buying something that says, oh, it can give me all this information, so I'm just going to use all of it?
So, I mean, someone like me, I like raw data because I can play around with it and I can plug it into things, I can graph it, and I can do whatever I want. And it's that raw data is, the highest frequency and so the best data I can get. So that's what I want. But most clinicians don't want that because they won't know what to do with that data, right? So it's got to be processed somehow. And so that processing, you can lose data and you can lose focus and you can have misinterpretation along the way. And so it can be something it can be processed down to the point of where something might give you an efficiency score, right? Which is, unitless and essentially meaningless, where it says, your efficiency on that run was good, average, or bad.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's something completely processed down to the end where it gives you this kind of, 3 categories. I mean, what does that really tell you? Probably not much, right?
Yeah.
Or it could be somewhere in between. And so I think that's the hardest part here. And, what would be appropriate for a clinician isn't necessarily going to be appropriate for a consumer. So I think, again, we're going to start to see products that are aimed more at clinicians and aimed more at consumers as the hardware gets cheaper and more widely available. And people are going to kind of sort through and find things that work for them. Right.
Yeah. So I guess it's, when it comes to the output, it's kind of like food. You don't want things to be overly processed.
Yeah, exactly.
Because then it's just not good for you. Okay, cool. Well, now let's get to the book. So I'm just going to read. So the book, again, for people watching, the book is called The Science of Running. And it will be available on February 4th, but you can go to anywhere books are sold, Amazon or what have you, and you can pre-order. But I'm just going to read a quick description. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll read a quick description. Science of Running goes further than any other running book to interrogate the anatomy and physiology of the runner, showing how running involves and affects every system of the body, including the effect of oxygen on the muscles. The book breaks down the runner's stride scientifically, showing what's going on under the skin at every stage of the running cycle, highlighting common injury risks based on a runner's natural gait and showing how to correct them, takes a head-to-toe approach to 30 key exercises for runners, annotating the muscles, ligaments, and joints involved, and showing how to perfect precision in those exercises to optimize their benefits. Sounds great. How long did it take you to write this book? Because when you read,
I could have used more time.
Oh, that's a throwaway. He probably did that in a weekend. But I mean, this is a very involved book. It's not like just a pamphlet.
No, it was a lot of work. I won't deny that. And it was a really interesting process for me. Essentially, it's like what we just talked about sort of boiling down that kind of raw data or the raw science, and being able to filter it down to a level that's interpretable by kind of the general public or the average runner. Because essentially what this is, it's a handbook for runners about their bodies, right? And
so this is for the average person, runner, and for the clinician, right? So it's not like overly technical, but rather technically simplified.
Exactly. I mean, it's not simple. There's a lot of information in there, right? And we've done our best at, with the artwork and that sort of thing to be able to explain the science behind all of this. But it's there's a lot of information in there. It's not a textbook, and it's not an academic book, but it's very much for runners and clinicians, I think, to have on hand, whether it's in a clinical context, if you want to be able to explain, an injury to a runner, or explain what you mean by what's happening during the running stride. There's a lot of artwork and chunks of text in there that can kind of help to explain that. And for the average runner, I think it's sort of something that they can keep on hand and use, if they're training for a race or just in general, or something to kind of, refer back to and over and over again. And there's also a whole chapter full of training plans.
Nice.
Was co-written by my coach, Jerry Ziak. And again, that's a very comprehensive chapter there.
Fabulous. And so I'm going to say this again. So for the people that are watching, if you leave a comment or a reaction, you're automatically in the running to win a copy of this book. So please, give a thumbs up or a heart or throw in and whatever, like where you're watching from or listening in from, because we'll pick a winner and I'll contact you when we're done with the interview and everything. But so when you talk about a book like this, is there ever sort of misinterpretation by someone to say, oh, it's a book on how not to get injured when you run? This is a book on preventing injuries.
Yeah, I mean,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, for anyone familiar with the research on running injuries, that's a pretty murky field at best, anyway. I think what I tried to do in this book was present what the research does tell us, and kind of show, let's take foot strike, for instance, because everyone knows about, foot strike pattern. And, we talked about, okay, what happens when you rear foot strike? What happens when you forefoot strike? And rather than taking the approach that one is inherently bad and will give you an injury, we talk about, how they affect your stride and where those forces go and that sort of thing. To be able to educate the runner on that, rather than talk about, this particular way of running will prevent injury. There's also a large section where we've got about 30 different strengthening exercises in the book where you can, go through. And again, it's all visualized with artwork showing different stages of the exercises, on specific running strengthening exercises that you can do in the gym or at home. Awesome.
Well, it sounds like it's a great resource for clinicians and the runner alike. And are you going to, after doing this, and this was, I'm sure, an arduous task that took quite a while, are you going to write a follow-up? Is that already in the works, or are you like, oh my God, just publish this book?
I haven't really even opened this book yet since I got it. I got it about 3 weeks ago, and I don't think I might have just opened it once to kind of flip through very briefly.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'm ready just to kind of keep it on the shelf and see what happens. But no, nothing in the works right now. I think I'm focusing on some other things right now, and if that opportunity comes up, down the line, then perhaps I'll look at that then. But this was a very interesting process to go through. I have no regrets. I think it's pretty cool to see a book with your name on it. But I think I'll take a little break for a while now from books. Yeah.
What was, for you as now an author, what was the best part of writing this book for you? It might have been like as a person, as a clinician, as a researcher. What was like the big positive for you?
Well, in research, we're always talking about knowledge translation, right? You have to kind of get that research to the end user, and how you do that. It's often very difficult for a researcher. This gave me a lot of tools, I think, in my own field of how to get that research the end user, whether it's a clinician or a runner themselves. So that's been really useful. Also, I think working in the clinic, it made me really think about, what are the exercises I think are most valuable, or what is the most useful thing that a clinician would get out of this book. I'm often sort of pulling out a textbook to try and explain something to a patient who's in the clinic because they've got an injury and I'm talking about too much too soon or something like that, and I want a graphic where I can say, look, this is why too much too soon is bad, or this is why, you know, running the way you're running might have led to this injury. And I'm often sort of ending up doing stickman drawings or something to try and illustrate that.
Yeah, we all do that.
Yeah, which is fine. But you know, this certainly gives me a resource, and hopefully others a resource in the clinic to be able to sort of say, here, like, this is what I'm talking about, and here's a nice sort of visualization and some kind of bullet points as to, you know, what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's great. So I feel like to me, it sounds like it's made you maybe a little more present, a little more thoughtful about what you're doing with runners and why you're doing it.
Yep, for sure.
Which is great. And I'm assuming that's also the goal of the book, is to have people be a little bit more present, understand the way their body works. This is for the runner, the way their body works and why they're doing what they're doing. And for the clinician, maybe taking a larger analytical view as to the person in front of them, the runner in front of them, and maybe why they're getting the injuries that they're getting, and some options on how to rectify that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think runners are typically type A people, right?
Yeah.
And they, you know, they get really into running and they want to know more, and they want to learn, like, okay, what shoes should I have, and what's the best way to run, and what's the best way to train, and you know, so they're on Google and they're trying to get all this information. There's tons of conflicting information out there, even from, you know, some of the top sources, right? You might be sort of the top sources for that. So again, hopefully this is something that kind of boils it down. It's very evidence-based and something that runners can rely on as a resource for all things running.
Sounds great. Now, listen, before we wrap things up, I have one last question. It's one that I ask everyone, and that's, knowing where you are now in your life and in your career, what advice would you give to yourself as a new grad right out of physio school?
So I would, right out of physio school, I think just get your hands dirty and see patients, try and get lots of different experiences. If you're interested in sports, volunteer with teams. You know, don't expect payment right away for those things. Get out and work with people and put in the time, and you'll learn a lot, and those will turn into opportunities in the future. Mm-hmm. I think getting out and not saying no to things is a big thing, and I think that's how I kind of got involved in working with professional and sort of national team athletics. It's because basically one opportunity led to another, and I didn't say no along the way, and so it just, you know, one thing snowballed into the next thing. So I think you know, that's probably my advice. Just get out, start getting your hands dirty, and get the practical experience, and don't say no.
Awesome. Great advice. Now, where can people find you if they want to have, if they have questions, they have more, if they want to find more info about you and about the book? Where can they find you?
Probably the best place is on Twitter. I'm fairly active on Twitter, and they can find me at Runner Physio on Twitter, and they can contact me through that. Also, if people have, you know, wanting to access any of my papers, that sort of thing, they can reach me through my email address, which is chris.napier@ubc.ca. Happy to send along papers, or if you have any sort of specific questions, happy to answer them if I can.
Awesome. And what we'll do is, when this broadcast ends, I'll go back in and I'll put a link to your Twitter and to some of the papers that we spoke about today, and a link to the book. So if people want to pre-order the book, go for it. For all the people who are on and who had some reactions or comments, I will pick a winner for someone to win Chris's book, and you'll be hearing from me. I'll get in touch with you via Facebook. So Chris, thank you so much for taking the time out and coming on to do a live. And then it'll be on the podcast as well, but to do a Facebook Live. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. It's been a good chat, and thank you also for all your work in the lead up to the World Congress, with all your Facebook Live interviews with a lot of our speakers, because that was really great to be part of that.
Yeah, that was my pleasure. It was great. So, and everyone who's on and watching, thank you so much, and have a great couple of days, and stay healthy, wealthy, and smart.
Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to the podcast at podcast.healthywealthysmart.com. And don't forget to follow us on social media.